You know, I hate when people talk from their computers, but they said $1 a page. And my talk's 22 pages long, so. No, I have lots of double spacing. Okay. So this talk is called From Black Power to the New Jim Crow. It could be called Whatever Happened to Black Politics. It could be called What Happened to the Black Movements of the 1960s. But I want to try to describe how we went from the high point of the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s to the so-called colorblind politics of today in the age of mass incarceration. What has changed in Black politics over the last 40 years, what that means for the struggle for Black liberation today, are some of the things that I want to try to address. So in that sense, I'm not really going to be talking about specifically or narrowly the rise of mass incarceration. It's more a political understanding of the transformation of African American life in this country and also politics. To begin with, I want to start with the high point of the Black struggle in the 1960s. The African American struggle of the 1960s, without question, transformed American politics. It ended the era of Jim Crow in the South. It ensured the right for African Americans to vote literally 100 years after the end of the Civil War. And it also opened up the space for a struggle, an explosion of struggle really across the urban North against the invisible Jim Crow of school segregation, of housing segregation, so on and so forth, until the end of the decade, which produced really across the board a new and deeper understanding of racism in this country and its impact on African Americans. The Black Power rebellion, expressed most dramatically by the explosion of uprisings through the middle of the 1960s, forced the dire conditions experienced by African Americans in cities across this country from the margins of politics and political discussion in this country to the center. From 1963 through 1968, more than 500,000 Black people participated in rebellion, uprisings, riots, whatever you want to call them, in some degree or another, which says nothing about the wider support for those acting in rebellion. Black rebellion created an urgency for the government to act, and those acts included an expansion of social welfare policies that responded to everything from unemployment to the demands for daycare, to the demands for an expansion of welfare services, food stamps, and through the creation of affirmative action policies and programs to demand hiring of African Americans, to demand an end of substandard housing, access to higher education, and to generally increase the quality of life for Black people in this country. The government itself, the state, expanded its services in such a way as to create job opportunities for Blacks. That's when the increase in Black employment in the public sector came into being, was a result of the expansion of these social programs in the 1960s. There was an urgent understanding from the ruling class in the state in this country that the ability to give Blacks some kind of quality of life and to create a kind of a social mobility would stop the constant rioting, which was always a surprise when it happened. The Black Power era was also happening at a time of international rebellion, and the ruling class, as well as Black people involved in the rebelling or in the communities where the rebellions were happening, saw the Black uprisings in the context of global rebellion. From the guerrilla war against American imperialism in Vietnam, to the struggles in France in May of 1968, to the growth in popular Black revolutionary organizations across the United States. The question of the possibility of revolution in this country and abroad was not just a sort of reactionary delusions of the right, but reflected the ascending promises of the left. The Wall Street Journal in September of 1968 ran a front page article titled, "Can It Happen Here?" And it wasn't, sort of hysteria. It was really going through whether or not it was possible for a revolution to happen in the United States. And in the United States, it was understood that the revolutionary potential or possibility was fueled by the Black struggle for liberation. From urban rebellion to the formation of Black revolutionary organizations like the Black Panthers, or Black revolutionary organizations and workplaces like the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement reflected that. And in terms of the reach and why this wasn't just a hysterical reaction on the behalf of the ruling class, I was pretty amazed at this. At the height in 1970, the Black Panther Party's newspaper had a circulation of 139 copies sold a week in the United States. Just think about that. For people who are in the ISO, who go on paper sales and, sell papers during the week, they had a circulation of 139,000 papers sold, 139,000 sold every week in the year 1970. 40%, so the reach of the Black Panther Party, is much further beyond what the actual membership was. 40% of young African Americans under the age of 25 said that they supported the Black Panthers. And what did it mean to support the Black Panther Party? Some of their demands, which were laid out in their paper every week, that is reaching 139,000 people in 1970, is the demand for full employment for African Americans, a demand for decent housing for Black people, a demand for control of one's community, demand for political education, not just the right to education, but to a particular kind of education that focused on the history and politics of African Americans, a demand for free health care, an end to police brutality, an end to American wars of aggression, and a demand for the freedom of all oppressed people in prisons and jails, military prisons, federal prisons, state, local prisons, but also in jail as well. And so beyond the obvious radicalism inherent in these demands, the impact of the Black rebellion was extremely wide. And so that by the end of the 1960s, it was widely accepted, even in mainstream politics, that Black oppression was material, that it was structural, and that racism was deeply implicated in the condition of Black people. For example, in 1968, how many people here know what the Kerner Commission is? Okay, so the Kerner Commission is this panel of experts that is put together by Lyndon Johnson in March of 1968. It's in March of 1967, after the Detroit rebellion had happened in July. It was the biggest, up until that point, riot in American history. It was the first time since the Civil War that troops were deployed to occupy an American city. And so Lyndon Johnson panels this commission to investigate the reasons why these riots are happening. They spend millions of dollars to send investigators to 225 American cities. They interview hundreds of people in each of these cities who are in the riot areas. And so in March of 1968, March 1st, 1968, the commission releases its report. This is from, I'm going to read from the introduction of the report, to give people an understanding how by the end of the 1960s, this is 1968, so by the end of the decade, there is a generalized understanding about what racial oppression means and looks like in the United States. Quote, We have visited the riot cities, we have heard many witnesses, we have sought the counsel of experts across the country. This is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving towards two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Segregation and poverty have created a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. What white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implicated in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. Social and economic conditions in the riot cities constitute a clear pattern of severe disadvantage for Negroes compared with whites, whether the Negroes lived in the area where the riot took place or outside of it. So that's from the federal government. And I defy anyone to try to imagine any hack from the Democrats or the Republicans in government today to make any kind of remote claim like that. And so it was understood from revolutionaries to the most, liberal. I mean, this was a commission that was headed by the governor of Illinois, so not a radical, but it was widely understood that racism was material, that it was structural. In the book Black Power by Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, Black revolutionaries, they coined the phrase institutional racism to underline the notion that black oppression was not simply the result of prejudicial or backward ideas, but that racism in America was about power, authority, and capitalism, and that all the institutions governing the United States, be they public or private institutions in industry that were deeply invested in the economy of the United States, all were a part of a racist structure that worked to keep blacks in a certain subjugated condition. And so the question is, how is it that we have gone from a federal government that indicts the, quote, complicity of whites in maintaining the ghetto to an almost national declaration, an agreement that race doesn't exist, really, that outside of people's own individual attitudes and minds, that it's not really a factor? How do we go from the Kerner Commission to this notion that could even be fantasized about in the media in 2008 around Obama's campaign, that we were entering a post-racial period where race would no longer sort of play a central or meaningful role in American society? How did the U.S. politically transform itself into a colorblind society? And what does that actually mean in a country that still experiences deep disparities between African Americans and the rest of the country? So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking, trying to answer that question. Of course, the United States has always been a color-conscious society, not a colorblind society. A country that was built on the wealth of slavery only after it had waged a genocidal campaign against an indigenous population that was here. As a settler state, the U.S. was deeply dependent beyond slavery, was deeply dependent on immigrant labor from all over the world when the system was, of slavery was ended by the Civil War. And so race and the management of race within the context of labor has always been central to American capitalism. But it was the control of black labor in particular that has always been a central feature of American capitalism, either through slavery or in the aftermath of slavery. There were things called contract leasing, blacks who were picked up for petty crimes who were then leased out to white plantation owners to do work, to work off their debts. Black codes, which were implemented in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War to literally control the labor and movement of black people. And then eventually the system of Jim Crow that had an impact on the sort of social control and movement of black people, but also that has to be understood in the larger political economy of racism in the South. Alan Moss just did a wonderful talk on the history of Jim Crow. I would encourage people to get that recording after the conference, because I'm not going to go through the Jim Crow system. But even though the heart of Jim Crow laws were based in the South, the 1896 Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson that made the that legalized the sort of standard of Jim Crow of separate but equal conditions, public accommodations, facilities, basically wrote that into law. And it was written into law not just for the South, but it basically nationalized this kind of segregation for the country of the whole. The Supreme Court made this basically a national phenomenon. Even still, in the North, Jim Crow laws were not specifically implemented in terms of being written into law, but they definitely did control and dictate the movements of African Americans through things like residential segregation, the use of racially restricted covenants, which allowed white homeowners in particular to basically write into the legal paperwork that this house can never be sold to a black person. This was the norm in the North until a Supreme Court decision overruled that in 1948. But as blacks moved into the North, and because there were not explicit laws written about their political participation and specific laws written about the control of African Americans, moving into the North began to create political problems for the Northern ruling class. There were a few things that were happening. One is black people were escaping the conditions of racism, segregation, racial terrorism across the South, and were coming to the North by the hundreds of thousands. I think by the end of, into the Second War, by the end of the, I think, 1960s, there have been 6 million African Americans who had moved into the North through what people describe as the Great Migration. And African Americans were coming with the expectation of being in the, coming to the land of hope. That's how people described the North, with the hope of getting away from the racism and brutality of the South. Those hopes and that sense of coming to the land of hope were quickly dashed as blacks found themselves in the worst jobs, housing, the worst schools, et cetera. But there were two things that were different about it compared to life in the South. One is that blacks were increasingly becoming a political constituency that had to be responded to in the North. And the best example of that, or one of them, is the election of 1960 between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, where it was clearly the black vote that gave Kennedy the presidency. And so because of this dynamic, it meant that you couldn't just wholesale ignore the conditions and the demands of black people. It was also the case that in the North, blacks were able to form organizations and engage in a range of politics, from electoral politics to radical politics, in a way that was impossible in the South. For example, the NAACP was declared an illegal organization in the South in the 1950s, let alone the Communist Party or any sort of radical formations. And so the ability to engage in politics in an open way meant that there was actually quite a bit of protest, movement, and organizing around the conditions of black life, of urban black life, throughout the post-war period. And when that struggle against racism couldn't be organized or confined within organization, blacks broke out in revolt in what would become a preview for the 1960s. In Harlem, in both 1935 and 1943, there were black rebellions in response to, again, police racism and brutality. In Detroit, a huge riot in response to racism and just conditions around housing in 1943 that was a precursor to the 1967 rebellion. But regular black protest against housing segregation, police violence, and unemployment brought national attention to these issues. So that wasn't just something that was confined or completely ignored. And the national attention in the context of the Cold War meant that there was also international attention that was attracted as well. For much of the 20th century, the United States and the Soviet Union vied for political influence and superpower supremacy through the, for the globe. The U.S. projected itself as a bastion of democracy, liberty, a force for good in the world. As we know, the United States never goes to war for bad things, for imperial aims or world domination. It only goes to war against evil and for good. And so, but the problem, and I mean, you think about it up until now, it's like we invade places to bring democracy or to bring, evil people to justice. But the constant problem with this narrative throughout the 20th century has been the black question, that despite the rhetoric about democracy and bringing either good to places or taking out evil, the condition of black people in the United States has always raised a question about the veracity of that framework, particularly at a time in the post-war era when it's a time where the colored people of the world literally have gone into rebellion against their white colonial masters of the West. So literally China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Cuba, the entire colored population of the globe is going into rebellion, and you still have this bipolar situation of the United States and Russia who are fighting for greater influence. And the problem that the United States has, for example, is that when new diplomats from Africa are coming to the American capital, the capital of democracy, what they don't know is that Washington, D.C. is a southern state. And as a southern state or southern entity, it operates under the rules of Jim Crow. And so you have African diplomats who are coming to Washington, D.C. being treated as if they were American blacks, meaning being treated as second-class people. This creates an enormous political problem for the U.S. and its projections as an imperial power. And so obviously there is a Southern civil rights movement that forces the issue in a very accelerated way of changing the law, of getting race out of American law. The North begins to do this with various Supreme Court decisions in 1948 around racial covenants in real estate, the Brown versus Board decision in 1954. There are all kinds of examples like this, but it's the Southern civil rights movement that forces the question in a more dramatic way, that finally breaks the back of Jim Crow across the South. And the U.S. is able to get race out of its law. And so there is a way in which the removal of race from the law in the United States ushers in this period of colorblind politics. There is a logic that is reinforced by some well-meaning sociologists. There's a guy named Gunnar Myrdal who wrote a book called An American Dilemma, which is a very interesting book. It's a very long book. He got millions of dollars to write this book that basically says, there's an American creed that, America really does represent democracy and all of these great things, but there's this problem with race that it has. And he goes through great detail of what it is, that if they get rid of race, if they remove this problem of race, then America will almost be like a utopia. And so, so race is essentially taken out of out of the law. And what is the benefit of colorblindness? It's coming at a time at the end of the movements of the 1960s and really the beginning of a backlash in some ways. Colorblindness helps to shift the debate away from the deep questions that were raised initially by the Black liberation movement, questions about the inequality of capitalism, the institutionalization of racism, and the structural critiques of the American economic system, a system that always seemed to leave blacks out. And a new explanation for these factors begins to take place that I'll get into in a second. But it's not just happening in a vacuum. The rising issue and debate about colorblindness is not just happening in a vacuum. It's coming in conjunction with several other factors that are important to weigh in. One is the destruction of the Black left in particular. I talked about the Black Panther Party and the rise of their popularity, evidenced by the 139,000 circulation of their newspaper at one point in 1970. And the price to be paid for that was that Panthers were executed and imprisoned. There are still Black Panthers who are imprisoned to this very day. Beyond that, there was the total infiltration and disruption of Black organizations. And it was seen by the federal government, if it declares Martin Luther King, you know, one of the greatest threats to the internal security of American society, you can imagine what it thought about those who stood to his left. And so part of that repression also involves the assassination of Black political leaders, in addition to the crushing of Black organization. There's also the co-optation, the deliberate strategy of co-optation of Black politics. Those who could not be killed were co-opted into electoral politics, really as a way to temper political radicalism. Black demands for community control in Black political centers like Newark, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan were granted. And so you have Black mayors taking over crumbling, economically devastated cities as its tax base is leaving in the form of a sort of mass exodus from those cities. At the same time, you have an economic recession taking hold, and there's not enough money, literally, to create or maintain a social welfare net. And so nationally, you also have the Democratic Party, which is absorbing African Americans into its structure in a way that had been fairly unprecedented. And this was all a concerted effort to temper radicalism and really replace it with pragmatism, which is, you know, now that you're in power, how are you going to basically run and control these cities, compelling people who had been formerly activists into the politics of being more realistic. And there was a certain truth to that if you're going to take over the reins of these cities in the current condition that they were in. And then the third component of this was that the way in which economically and socially affirmative action sort of allowed for the ascendance of a small layer of African Americans who could be pointed to as success stories for the rest of Black America. That is, if no Blacks were ever allowed to succeed under capitalism in the system, then it would be hard to really sell this as a legitimate system. And you would have the same problem that they had been having, the ruling class had been having throughout the post-war period, which is Black rebellion, Blacks burning down American cities, the international spectacle that this now creates when the U.S. is trying to, basically continue to assert itself as a world power. And so part of how you deal with that is to actually create some success stories. And so the development of a small Black middle class could play that role and could be instrumental in socially and politically really disciplining the majority of the rest of the black population that was still being held at bay, demonstrated in still higher unemployment rates, sort of marooned in the lowest paying section of jobs, substandard housing, substandard schools, all the rest of it. So those conditions never changed for the majority of people, but some space was opened up for others. And people, African Americans hear it always. Why can't you be like X, Y, or Z? And now with a black president, it's always about how can you people complain about anything? There's a black president, and so that is all part of the dynamic, the dynamic around this. And so all of these things combined in such a way to begin making sense of political rhetoric that moved away from a structural analysis of black poverty and deprivation and began to embrace a politics that began to blame blacks for their own condition. It dovetailed also with an emerging neoliberal framework that was based on the idea that much of public governance should be deferred to private capital. And because so much of the federal expansion of the government in the 1960s was directly related to combating discrimination, to taking race out of the law, that the removal of race from law in some ways legitimated the need for a smaller government, for less government. And if the U.S. was an evolving meritocracy, then it would limit the need for the state and state intervention, especially when much of that intervention had been based on behalf of blacks throughout the 1960s. But when economic recession set in, and black unemployment began to swell once again in the early 1980s, by 1982, there was 20% black unemployment in the U.S., that this was a particularly useful line of argument. By shifting the discussion to one of personal responsibility and away from structural inequality, it let the system off the hook. I'm going to go slightly over, but thank you for that update. It let the system off the hook and shifted responsibility onto African Americans. And then when Reagan takes office in the 1980s, both the discussion of personal responsibility escalates exponentially, and it coincides with the destruction of the social safety welfare net. And so you get all of the talk about welfare queens that are black women who were cheating the welfare system. Ronald Reagan, if people have read The New Jim Crow, if you haven't, you should. But she talks about how there's a declaration, the war on drugs is declared even though there's no drug problem, and on some list of things that people think are a problem in society, drug abuse is at the very bottom of it, but nonetheless a war on drugs is declared. And so in place of this social welfare state that the Reagan administration is deftly sort of displacing, you get a rise in the prison and policing state. The war on drugs is declared, and billions of dollars are shifted away from social programs that were fought for in the 1960s and are shifted to law enforcement. And so along with the rise of the prison and policing state comes with it this sort of deeply entrenched racial demonization, dehumanization that is also connected to colorblindness. That the reason why these people are in these conditions are not the institutional racism or the Kerner Commission report that was widely accepted in the 1960s. It's now about we've removed race, we've removed the fetters. There's no reason why black people in the United States should ever complain about anything ever again. We've removed the fetters. If you have failed, it is your own fault. But what is also happening, which I think is important, is that it's not just, sort of battering session of black people, but conservative strategist Kevin Phillips makes a very important observation of the 1980s. He declares the 1980s as a sort of society that there's this unprecedented, the most unprecedented transfer of wealth from poor to rich, or from one class to another in the absence of a revolution. And so while at the same time there's this onslaught of racial racism in the state that is picked up in a very popular level and popular consciousness, the rich are taking, raking it in, taking it to the bank. The greatest transfer of wealth from one class to another outside of a revolutionary situation. There's another classic example of the way that racism is really used by the elite to, not just divide and distract. I mean, black communities are destroyed, people's lives are destroyed, and there is a group of people who are getting rich off of that. And what is sort of underlining that as well, what is happening in black communities. In the early 1970s, more than 70% of blacks were in manufacturing. By 1987, that number was down to 28%. And you combine that with an era of mass incarceration, which means that an X number of people are in prison at a given time. But the thing that Michelle Alexander is describing is the way in which the engagement with the state, picking people up for minor drug offenses, shuttling them in and out of prison, creates this much wider layer of people who then get caught in the snare of the new Jim Crow. So, for example, on the west side of Chicago, in the neighborhood of Lawndale, where the riots in Chicago on the west side were concentrated in 1968, 70% of black men aged 18 to 45 are ex-offenders, 60% of whom were in prison for minor jail offenses. And we know that those people are not getting jobs. They weren't getting jobs in the best of times. They're not getting jobs now, and the news wonders why there's like a problem with violence on the west and south sides of this city. I have to begin to wrap this up, but one thing that I wanted to point out that I think that is very important in terms of understanding the 80s and 90s, and one of the key differences between that period and the 1960s was that much of this misery that is happening in urban communities that I just described is being overseen by black mayors and black administrators. Throughout the 1980s, there were black mayors in most of the major cities in the United States, so like Chicago, New York, LA, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. And this had been a demand of the Black Power movement in the late 1960s, community control. They rejected the idea that the, quote, white power structures should be controlling the spaces that black people lived in, and that this reality contributed to the sense that African Americans constituted an internal colony within the United States, which was a popular framework for understanding black oppression in the 1960s. And there was a corollary between that. So one of the demands was to have control over these spaces. And so with that happens at the same time the tax base is declining, there's mass unemployment and poverty, but now you have, unlike the 1960s and the volatile specter of those dynamics with white people controlling it, now you have black people controlling it. And so this was part of the sort of dual legacy of the 1960s and the post-civil rights era, the emergence of a black political elite and the black middle class, and the ingratiation, really, of layers of that layer into the Democratic Party and giving them control of the black population, the main black population centers in the U.S. And this begins to really underline, to some degree, where we are at today with the sort of deep division that exists amongst blacks. The division, the class divisions among African Americans really is the distinguishing characteristic of black life in the U.S. today versus what it was in the 1960s. So I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff and then wrap up here. Yeah, okay. So in terms of so we have the issue of the class divide, partly which is deeply reflected in the election of Barack Obama in 2008, who also represents, I think, yet another sort of expression of a change in black politics, where when we talk about the 1980s and the mayors who are overseeing these black population centers there, many of them had had some connection to or affiliation with the civil rights movement of the 1960s and really used those movement credentials as a way to get away with what they were getting away with, to get away with the keeping things clamped down in these communities in the 1980s, when the economic impact of them was quite harsh. The new crop of black politicians who sort of develop in the 1980s and certainly into the 2000s were younger, without any real connection to the civil rights struggles of the 1960s, tended to be Ivy League educated, and also tended to be completely enmeshed with a new direction in the Democratic Party, which was not one of appealing to blacks to try to absorb blacks in, but was really focused on changing the terms of the debate around understanding poverty and inequality in this country as one having to do with personal responsibility. And Barack Obama was really the embodiment of this. Where he talked about race briefly when he was forced to in his campaign in Philadelphia a speech, because he was being assailed about his connection to Jeremiah Wright. But beyond that, not only is he at pains not to talk about race, but when he does, it's usually racist. Whether it's, and that really underlines the distance, both not just economically in terms, because people have always described the black middle class as people making $50,000, which I'm not sure if that constitutes middle class, but it's the political distance that has emerged and that exists between the black political elite, some of whom do represent a black 1%, and their particular role in perpetuating the politics of personal responsibility, so much so that it has taken hold. And so if you have a 40-year retreat from a structural understanding of racism to 40 years of personal responsibility, it begins to take a toll, so that more than 50% of blacks today blame, quote, a lack of personal responsibility for their own condition. Less than a third of African Americans identify discrimination as a factor. And the younger the black person is who is polled, the more likely they are to say that it's their own fault for their condition and not racism. So the further you get away from the movement and the politics of the 1960s, the more likely you are to blame yourself. And so what is the key to changing this dynamic? Where do we go from here? How does that shift? And I think a couple of things, and I'll end on this, is there's the hardening division between the black elite and the middle class and the mass of black people that raises important questions about allies and solidarity, because even blacks as a whole are not going to be able to wage a fight that transforms American society. It's 12% of the population. So in that sense, there has to be a clear rebuilding of independent organization in politics that takes on the worst aspects of racism and inequality. And at the heart of that means actually getting back to a real understanding of what racism actually is, that it's not in and of itself about the personal ideas and attitudes of individuals, but that it still exists in terms of power, authority, and capitalism within this society, and that it infects all of the institutions of the society. And so there has to be a sort of that has to be brought largely back into the center of the question. And then there are the issues of solidarity. And on the one hand, the American state creates the objective conditions for solidarity all the time. We talked about this in the last meeting, how even though the sort of expansion of the policing and prison state was focused on African Americans in the aftermath of the movement, and a way to make sure that there was not a reemergence of a radical black movement, you can also see how it can quickly be used to pivot in other directions, whether it's to crack down on Occupy last fall, whether it's to then be sort of redirected to trample on the rights of immigrants, et cetera. And that becomes the basis upon which solidarity can be built. But solidarity based upon objective conditions has never been enough, that there has to be a political understanding of the centrality of racism in American society. And this is one of the things that absolutely happened in the 1960s as a result of that political movement, was the transformation of ideas of, not just millions of white people, although that's important to know that by the end of the 60s, there was a majority of support for things like affirmative action. A majority of people supported the end of executions in the United States that were disproportionately then also focused on African Americans. But there was also a transformation of African Americans themselves as being seen as something different from the victims of Jim Crow and the victims of racism, but people who could literally transform politics in the United States as a result of their struggle. And I think that we're at the very beginning of rebuilding that kind of movement as a result of the vast net and web that has been created by the criminal justice system. If you are black in this country, it is very hard not to know someone who has had some engagement with the criminal justice system, either in prison, on parole, harassed, beaten up, shot, killed by the police. And that has created a vast network of people that objectively it exists to build a movement with that. Politically, we have to get beyond the sort of ideas that you can't actually fight the state because of the all-encompassing power that assumes, but also that web also connects to wider parts of the society. For all the millions of dollars that are spent on maintaining the prison state, the policing state takes money away from everyone for schools, for housing, pensions, and all the rest of it. So those conditions exist. It's a political question as to whether or not we can build upon that and create a movement that's not just like what happened in the 1960s, because that's not going to happen again, but that can actually go further to take up where they left off, which deals with the bigger question of what kind of society is one that relies on not just racial division, but racism and the subjugation of entire groups of people for the enrichment of a few.